Recently, I did something that could earn me the Darwin Award. I helped free a murderer who has now vowed to kill me next. Hi, I'm Christo Grozev, an investigative journalist. On August 1st, 2024, a massive prisoner swap took place between Russia and the West. As I've explained in early episodes of this series, it was the largest multilateral prisoner swap since the Cold War, involving 24 people in total. 16 were released back to the West, including American journalists and famous Russian dissidents who had opposed Putin's regime and will now have to live their life in exile. On the other side, 8 Russian prisoners were returned to Moscow. Among them were several spies, a bunch of convicted hackers, and most outrageously for many, an assassin. My team's reporting helped put many of these characters in prison in the first place. This is the story of Vadim Krasikov, Putin's favorite assassin. Krasikov first came onto my radar in August 2019. At that time, I was working for the open source investigative platform Bellingcat. I remember that day very clearly. We were doing OSINT training for African journalists in Johannesburg. Right in the middle of my presentation, the news came that a murder had taken place in Berlin's popular Tiergarten Park, in broad daylight. I involved the whole training class in trying to solve the whodunit. The murdered man was Zeliham Hangushvili, a Georgian who fought alongside Chechen militias in the Second Chechen War against Russia. He had relocated his family to Germany after several prior attempts on his life in Georgia and Ukraine. On the morning of the assassination, witnesses at the park said that Hangushvili had been walking through the wooded park, likely on his way back home from the nearby mosque. A man on a bike went up to him, pulled out a suppressed Glock 26 and shot him 3 times, once in the shoulder and twice in the head, killing him instantly. Then he ditched his bike, pistol and disguise into the near Spree River. He then mingled with a crowd of tourists on his way to pick up an electric scooter, conveniently pre-parked for him nearby, when he was picked up by the police. A couple of teenagers had spotted him as he was shedding his disguise in the bushes and called in a tip. As you might expect from a trained Russian assassin, the murderer didn't admit to his crime. Instead, he insisted that he had nothing to do with the murdered man in the park. He said his name was Vadim Sokolov, and he was simply a Russian tourist traveling around Europe. The passport he had on him when he was arrested suggested the same thing. A quick check by German police with the Russian authorities produced a glowing reference. Yes, this is indeed Vadim Sokolov, a law-abiding citizen with a clean criminal record. So what was happening here? Was it just the wrong tourist in the wrong bushes? A case of a seriously mistaken identity? We were going to find out. Now, what was certain by this time was that this had not been just a random act of violence, or an organized crime revenge killing. This murder bore many of the hallmark characteristics of a state-sponsored assassination. The murder was carried out in broad daylight with precision. It was execution style, with 2 control shots in the head at close range, a method consistent with professional assassinations. The killer had made the shots while riding a bike, a stunt much harder to achieve than it sounds. And the victim, Zeliham Hangushvili, had long been a target of the Russian state. He had been on Russia's most wanted list for years and had fled Georgia with his family to seek asylum in Germany because of the previous attempts on his life. So from the onset, it looked and certainly felt a lot like a hit job ordered by the Kremlin. But in the world of data journalism, we don't operate on hunches. We had to find the data to prove it. We had to figure out who this man was. Only then could we figure out who had sent him. As often happens in these investigations, first we had to figure out who this man wasn't. The name on the Russian tourist passport was Vadim Sokolov, born in 1970. My team, at that time a joint group from Bellingcat, The Insider in Russia and Der Spiegel in Germany, began looking into whether such a man even existed. On paper, his identity seemed almost flawless. He had a clean passport and a valid French visa. When applying for his visa, he had shown employment records as a civil engineer, a tax record, and a registered address in Russia. But when we dug deeper, certain digital cracks began appearing. First, we analyzed leaked Russian government databases. Indeed, Sokolov existed there, but only on the surface. You scratch the surface and Sokolov becomes a digital ghost. You see, all of his records in the Russian databases were implausibly fresh. His first passport had been issued a couple of months before the trip to Germany. His personal tax number had been created just a week before he applied for a visa. And the company that had issued his employment letter was in liquidation. At his registered address in Bryansk, neighbors said they had never seen this man. Online, we also couldn't find a digital footprint. No social media pages, no email accounts, no photographs. It was as if he had materialized overnight, just entering the digital world of government databases at the mature age of 49. Every real person leaves digital traces of the life they live, especially in the modern era where we live our lives online more and more. This is especially true in Russia, where the government obsessively records nearly every step their citizens take, every flight or train ride, every hotel stay, every doctor's appointment. They're all logged and logged and logged. And often, these logs are leaked or sold in the black market, which gives data journalists unbeatable points of reference. So when somebody appears in fresh government databases but doesn't exist in any of the older, previously leaked databases, there can be only one conclusion. He or she is a fake persona, a contrived identity created by the Russian government, made to look like they exist. The man arrested in Berlin was very much not Vadim Sokolov. But who was he? Finding the real identity behind a fake name is often the hardest part of any investigation. Professional spies and government assassins usually don't have their face plastered over social media. Thus, a reverse face search, which works to track down most civilians, usually yields empty results for the spies. So we had to start looking from something else. How about the name? Russian spies prefer retaining their real first name under the fake identity. Why? Well, first because it's easier to remember, but more importantly because you really don't want to be yelled at with the wrong name by an ex-classmate spotting you around the Eiffel Tower in Paris. So Vadim is often really Vadim. Another thing Russian spies also try to maintain between their real and fake identities is their birth date, so they don't forget it. But that's not a hard rule. Sometimes they're smart enough to memorize a different birth date, but one thing almost never ever changes. That's their zodiac sign. In Russia, zodiac signs are a big thing. Everyone knows what sign they are, and sometimes people even ask one another when they meet. I know this because when I was running radio stations in Russia, the daily horoscope was a must-have feature on the air. So Russian spies always default to their real zodiac sign in the cover identity, for fear of being asked, "What's your sign?" by a border official in a foreign country, and not being able to respond instinctively. I'm sure no border official outside Russia would ever think of asking this stupid question. Armed with a first name and a zodiac sign, I started searching through Russian databases for all the Vadims who were also a Leo and were born within a few years of 1970, the year of birth of the fake Vadim Sokolov. There were literally hundreds of those though, so my eyes were glazing and I was losing hope and planning to call it a night when something caught my eye. One of the Vadim Leos had a criminal record on suspicion of murder. More than that, he had been placed on the Interpol Red Notice list in 2013. More than that, Russia had recalled that Interpol notice within a couple of months of issuing it. Nothing to see here. And even more than that, in the summary of the alleged crime, there was the description: assassin approached the victim on a bicycle. The story of this assassination had even made it into the evening news on Russian television, and we found a TV report showing security camera footage of the assassin approaching the victim on a bicycle and shooting into him, diligently picking up the shells after the murder. This finding gave our team a strong hypothesis that the person who had been briefly wanted for the murder in 2013, Vadim Krasikov, might be the real person behind the fake persona Vadim Sokolov. Both were bicycle killers. Who else does that? Krasikov's murder had been whitewashed and his arrest warrant had been recalled, a telltale sign of a government cover-up. One was born on August 20th, 1917, the other, the real one, on August 10th, 5 years earlier. But who would resist the lure of being younger on their fake identity? I wouldn't. All of this made perfect sense, but we couldn't be sure unless we had a photograph of Vadim Krasikov. Easier said than done. All government records of Vadim Krasikov that contained a photograph had been mysteriously purged. No driver's license existed for him, despite the fact that a few cars had been registered in his name. And his passport file was locked for access, so no one could get his picture. Finally, we tracked somebody who had bought a car from Vadim Krasikov and had a scanned copy of his driver's license as part of the documentation. A very blurry photo indeed, but it allowed us to do a forensic comparison with the mugshot from the German police. And bingo, that was definitely the same person. So we were sure now that Krasikov was the murderer from Berlin and that he had killed at least one more person before. But how could we be sure that he had done both of these murders on behalf of the Russian state and not, say, as a contract killer paid for by unknown criminals? We had to do some more sleuthing, but it all paid off. First, we discovered that Krasikov had been involved with yet another murder in Russia, a third one, back in 2010. Court records showed that his accomplices, who unlike Krasikov had been arrested, were both senior former FSB officers. And one of them had received a personal Glock from the president of Kyrgyzstan for quote-unquote contributions to the country's national security. The accused had mentioned that award as a character reference in order to get released on bail. We then checked the flight records of that FSB officer and discovered that he indeed had flown once to the capital of Kyrgyzstan, Bishkek. And guess who else had been on the same flight? Vadim Krasikov. Thus, it was almost certain that Krasikov was also an FSB officer and had also likely received a Glock from that mysterious job the FSB had done for the Kyrgyzstan president. But the smoking gun, or should I say the smoking Glock, came from another data source. We were able to get the call records and telecoms metadata of Vadim Krasikov's phone for the period prior to the trip to Berlin. In the months leading up to this trip, Krasikov had been in regular contact with over a dozen current and former FSB operatives, most of them from a secretive elite unit of killers called Wimpel. But he wasn't just talking to them. His cell phone metadata showed that days before the undercover trip to Berlin, he had visited the FSB headquarters and spent several days at a top-secret compound belonging to the Wimpel unit. According to Russian state media reports, this compound is used to train operatives in shooting under quote-unquote extreme circumstances, such as shooting while hanging upside down, Tom Cruise style, shooting underwater, and shooting while riding a bicycle. All this evidence combined felt pretty damning to us. Our research had found a known serial murderer with clear ties to the Kremlin and the security apparatus, and he had the same face and personal details as our suspect. I felt completely confident that Sokolov was actually Krasikov, and German prosecutors agreed. Their 67-page indictment heavily cited Bellingcat's findings and my own testimony a total of 149 times, using our work to prove that the man in their courtroom wasn't just a killer, he was an FSB-trained assassin acting on direct orders from the Russian government to execute Hangushvili. During the trial, I was actually brought in to testify about our findings, and I was given my own cover identity. I was Witness G. Now, at this point, I had published a number of investigations about the Kremlin that revealed their crimes and put me on official persona non grata lists. But testifying against Krasikov was the first time I had to sit in a courtroom facing a known killer and reveal the truth that would put him away for life. Or so I thought. Krasikov stared me down the entire time I spoke. And even though the German court didn't reveal my name to the public, I knew Krasikov wouldn't forget Witness G. And now he's free. So how did that happen? Against all odds, I also played a part in that. And I'm not sure how to feel about it. In the years after Krasikov's arrest in Germany, Russia started arresting a number of political activists and journalists and imprisoned them on fraudulent charges. Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was one of these, and so was American journalist Evan Gershkovich. Dozens of Russian activists were also imprisoned for protesting against the war on Ukraine. As a result, I started looking for ways to get these prisoners released. One way was to convince Putin to release Navalny in exchange for Russians that he wanted to see freed from prisons in other countries. Putin actually explicitly hinted in an interview with Tucker Carlson that he would release journalist Evan Gershkovich if he was given back
a person serving a sentence in a country that is an ally of the US.
I knew immediately that he was specifically talking about Krasikov, who, we had since discovered, had actually been quite personally close to Putin during his time at the FSB. It is possible he was even Putin's personal bodyguard, but almost certainly he was his personal assassin. Putin wanted him free, and he was willing to trade for it. So as painful as it was to help release a murderer on whose hands was the blood of many, and as dangerous as it seemed to my own safety, I then ended up advocating for Krasikov's release. I thought, in the bigger scheme of things, saving the lives of innocent people languishing in Russian prisons is a higher moral imperative. Unfortunately, though, it was too late for Alexei Navalny. By the time we got all the governments to agree on the multilateral, complicated swap, Alexei was dead. He was killed in his Russian prison in February 2024. Despite Putin publicly stating that he had agreed to let him go, most likely the Kremlin's vengeful dictator could never afford to let his political archenemy live freely. But 16 other men and women were freed back to the West in the historic swap that took place. It's a morally challenging case, one that has kept me up at night for many, many nights. Hungushvili's family deserves Krasikov to serve out the sentence in jail. They deserved justice. Instead, he's now free in Moscow, probably getting awards, and Russian nationalists are urging him to kill again. Apparently, I'm near the top of that new kill list. But then again, our investigative work over the years has made overseas operations by Russian assassins much more difficult than before, hopefully protecting many more lives in the future. That's the true story of Putin's favorite assassin, and why he was hugged by Putin as a close friend upon arrival in Moscow. If you want to know more about the background of other spies who were exchanged in this momentous swap, check out the other videos below. And if you want to find out more about my investigations, subscribe and like.